Hi there, I'm Brian Foody. I'm from Iogen, and I'm here to talk to you about hydrogen and RNG and the opportunities and challenges to reach net zero. And there we are. Iogen's a technology company. We're focused on developing advanced cellulosic biofuels from agricultural residues and wastes. We did the first and only commercially successful cellulosic ethanol technology. It's now being deployed in Brazil at a multi-billion-dollar scale. We also did the first and only commercial deployment, at least only to date, of low-carbon hydrogen to make RNG to go into motor fuels. We're working on this deeply carbon-negative fuels, principally RNG or biomethane, serving hard to decarbonize sectors. This is a quick sketch of the basic flow sheet, and what you can see is biomass is taken in, products are produced, either methane or hydrogen or SAF, for example, and all of the fugitive CO2 is collected. But what I'm really here to talk to you about is three broad themes. First, deeply carbon negative second generation biofuels are going to be crucial to achieve net zero and full deployment of hydrogen. So that's a broad picture. Now, when people talk about net zero, there's a huge number of things to be done. And any net zero plan has to tie together things happening in three specific places: transforming the energy sector, reducing non-CO2 emissions, and removing carbon from the atmosphere. And there have been a number of plans prepared by large organizations that try to tie together all of the different things people are working on. This chart here just outlines the long-term strategy of the United States. This is how the U.S. laid things out. So in transforming the energy sector, three major components: energy efficiency, decarbonizing energy, electricity, and the energy transition. And you can see that takes up the largest element of how to reduce emissions. But there's also reducing non-CO2 emissions. That's like chlorofluorocarbons and things like that, or methane, and removing carbon from the atmosphere, either with land sinks or some kind of direct removal. All of those things need to be done to add up to net zero. But when you look at it and say, what role does bioenergy play? It's a big role. And it delivers both in the energy transition by delivering bioenergy for making fuels, and also by delivering biogenic carbon to fit into e-fuels. And then it also delivers in the removing carbon from the atmosphere with carbon dioxide removal. So all told, bioenergy contributes over 25% of the total emissions reductions in the US plan for reaching net zero. That's about 1.7 gigatons a year, and it covers those three distinct sectors I said: low carbon fuels, biogenic carbon for e-fuels, and CO2 removal. And I think it's worth noting that total of 26.5 is larger than efficiency and larger than decarbonizing electricity, larger than hydrogen. It's a very, very big and important deal that doesn't get as well noticed as it might because it's spread out across a range of different options and places. Now, that big contribution comes with a large demand for biomass resources. The U.S. Department of Energy and USDA have done a billion-ton study, so to speak, to look at what's sustainably available. The long-term strategy would draw between 2/3 and 90% of it. So there is the biomass available to be able to deliver all of this. But it's really important when you think about bioenergy that we're talking here about making cellulosic biofuels that need to deliver not only the fuel, but need to have all of their carbon captured and utilized in some other place. So basically the type of process that means is when a plant grows, it captures energy from the sun, CO2 from the atmosphere, it's pushed through a process, and any carbon that doesn't go into the fuel goes into CO2. Now, it's also going to help enable the deployment of hydrogen-based e-fuels, and that's because biogenic carbon will underpin about half of hydrogen's applications. So if you take a look at the net zero uses for hydrogen, this is just roughly speaking, 7.5% of total net zero would come from hydrogen directly, but another 8% would come from hydrogen-based e-fuels. So roughly half is actually fuels that are synthesized and pretty much always need carbon dioxide. And then 9.5% of the energy supply for net zero in the energy transition comes from low carbon biofuels. So you see in the little sketch, hydrogen's a bigger player on the energy side. And direct hydrogen doesn't need carbon, but the blue one does. So if you said, well, what if I ask, what about the carbon requirements? Where's that carbon coming from? It really has to be biogenic sources. And here I'm showing on the carbon share how much comes from bioenergy-based fuels, how much is needed by those hydrogen-based fuels like hydrogen-based SAF or any of the PTX products, and carbon dioxide removal. So there's my story. I hope it sounds convincing. Deeply carbon negative second generation biofuels are going to be crucial to achieving net zero and full deployment of hydrogen. They fit together and they're really necessary. Now let's talk about RNG, or biomethane, as a leading option for net zero scale second generation biofuels. And the challenge here as we go through it is actually going to be converting those major biomass feedstocks I talked about into RNG. So when you look at the big process technologies for converting biomass, like the straw shown here in this picture, into second generation biofuels for hard to abate sectors, we have biomass to liquids via gasification is a big process. Cellulosic ethanol, a field I'm deeply familiar with, plus an alcohol to jet, and then a gas to liquids process with RNG. I would say it's not obvious which the winners are going to be. There's pluses and minuses. At this juncture, our firm is placing its bets on gas to liquids with RNG, but we'll see. And it'll all depend on what's most scalable, what's most sustainable, and what's cost competitive. But we can look in the rearview mirror and say what has happened in the competition under the Renewable Fuel Standard for what wins as a cellulosic biofuel. And there's a very easy answer for that. Landfill gas particularly, or RNG, occupies almost all of the cellulosic biofuel market. There's almost no gasification-based products, and there's almost no cellulosic ethanol-based products. The core reason is landfill gas is really simple and really cheap. There's a factory that's making landfill gas. You can see how complicated it is. They just it's like from the Beverly Hillbillies. You poke something in the ground and up bubbles the gas. That only works on old people, I suppose. Now, to generate net zero scale volumes, RNG, though, is going to have to move way beyond landfills into ag residues and energy crops. This is a sketch again of the billion-ton study, and there's just a tiny portion of it that would be landfill gas today. In fact, landfill gas is heading to being tapped out right now, and we're nowhere near meeting the needs of net zero. We've got to target the big biomass sources. Now, is it doable to target those sources? And I have a very simple answer. Yes, with the same kinds of systems that underpinned the development and successful development of cellulosic ethanol that's being deployed in Brazil. And if you were in the cellulosic ethanol business, you'd say, wait a second, I recognize that process sketch, starting with pretreatment to make the fiber processable, and then going through a biological process and finishing up with recovering power from the residue. And that is what I believe to be the future of biomass-based fuels for net zero. So I'm not saying it's a winning option necessarily, but it's certainly one of the leading options that RNG will be a big player for net zero scale second generation biofuels. And the key is we've got to make it work on those big biomass feedstocks. Now let me talk about how RNG can enable production of net zero or carbon negative blue hydrogen. The challenge is going to be scaling well beyond the current RNG feedstocks, because hydrogen is a much bigger business. But the opportunity is markets like the IRA's 45V that value carbon reduction. Let me start off briefly about blue hydrogen. That's hydrogen made from natural gas, where you capture all of the CO2. It has a kind of a 70 to 80% reduction in overall greenhouse gases under the GREET model. Here's a little sketch of that. I can barely read it. Doubtless it's hard to read, but the first column is what happens before the carbon capture. The two lower bars are the upstream emissions of natural gas. These blue hydrogen plants can capture almost all of the CO2 at the plant, but they can't do anything about upstream, so they're left with just this 70 to 80% reduction, and that puts them under the IRA credits in sort of the blue zone, maybe getting 60 cents a kilogram of hydrogen. Now, what happens if you combine a blue hydrogen process with RNG, which sources its carbon from the atmosphere? And what you'll see here is that by comparison to fossil fuels, which emit 85 grams of CO2 per megajoule, electrolysis processes, which are totally zero, this type of blue RNG can deliver anywhere between 30 and 150 of net removals of CO2, depending upon how much is captured and where and so on. Now, those negative emissions could have substantial value under programs like the IRA's 45V, and I'll just give you a sense of that because RNG is removing CO2 from the atmosphere, it actually subtracts emissions. And by including it as a feedstock, you can take that chart I showed of a blue hydrogen and just lower the emissions right down to zero. And that shifts you from 60 cents a kilogram to a $3 a kilogram possibility. And that leaves me with my last conclusion. RNG can enable a production of net zero and carbon negative blue hydrogen. The challenge is going to be scaling it up because you have to figure out how to make lots of RNG, but there are markets that will pay real money for it. And with that, I'm open to questions. Mr. Hessler, what can I?
Thanks, Brian. That was great. Of the different intersections of the market conditions and the policy elements, which markets globally do you think, which regions are the most susceptible for driving biomass-derived hydrogen into markets?
Well, I think that the key to this kind of technology is around creating the very low carbon emissions. So what you want to do is look for markets where they value reducing the carbon emissions. So that's the big deal. And if I was to sort of tick them off, I'd say the IRA, the California LCFS values carbon emissions rather than just volume. The UK's SAF program does, and Germany's program under RED also does that. And in some ways it makes sense. If you're trying to reduce carbon emissions and you're creating a fuel mandate, why not mandate reducing carbon emissions? And so I think there's an element that's a path of the future. Any other questions? Now, I got to say, if I was at an employee event and I did this and I had this many questions, I'd say 20 bucks for a question, but I'm not going to do that here. Oh, over there, yes. What I'd say to the question of are we aiming at a specific offtake customer? Yeah, I was going to the question of are we aiming for a specific offtake customer? I'm aiming for people who are supplying products into those markets. So blue hydrogen producers, and what I'm going to do is deliver them RNG feedstock that can get them over the hump to $3 a kilogram applications, or SAF producers in the UK, or transportation fuel users in Germany. That's kind of the mix of people. So we see ourselves as a supplier of products that enable people to lower their greenhouse gas emissions, particularly in markets where lowering greenhouse gas emissions is super valuable. All right. Last call. Going, gone. Thank you very much.